And sir, we are live and streaming.
I'll get back on then. Hi, Sue. Is it nice down there today, Sue? You're going to have to unmute. I was trying to.
I was going to say it's sort of a 50-50. I took a walk around outside while we were on break, and the sky is finally blue today. It's been really smoky for quite a while, kind of yellow gray sky for days, but today it's blue sky because there's a really stiff wind out of the north.
Oh, is there?
So it's 51 degrees, blue sky, and a stiff wind from the north. So it's kind of, sunshine is nice, which we haven't had sunshine in a little while, so, because it couldn't get through the smoke.
It's nice here today. It's a fall day. It's a little cool. We had to cover the tomatoes.
Oh, well, when we had snow 2 weeks ago or whatever, that was the end of my tomatoes anyway.
Oh, I made some covers. We worked too hard to have tomatoes to let them die that soon.
Well, you know, we had like 3 days when it was in the middle 20s. That just kind of defeats covers.
Yeah, ours worked really good. I had to leave them covered for about 5 days, and then
Great.
yeah, they survived. So
Well, mine are all turning red on my dining room table.
yeah, yeah, that's right.
I don't need all those seats anyway.
Yeah, I know that's right. I went home and had a BLT for lunch.
Right.
Hi, Senator Schuler.
Heard you guys talking about forest fires. How's the fire going down there in Albany area?
Big, really big. And the wind the last couple days is just making it even bigger. I haven't looked in about 24 hours. I think yesterday morning it was up to about 65,000 acres.
Wow.
I'm not sure what it's at today.
My husband just got home from California. He was of that big fire, the Creek Fire,
Oh
the
yeah.
one where they had to airlift a bunch of people out. And then before that, he was down in Glenwood Springs. So he's been on 2 of the worst fires we've had, and they want him to go out again. And he's getting ready to retire in December. I said, don't do it. You know, you're too old for this.
Does he work for Forest Service?
Yeah, he's a district ranger in the Wasatch Cache.
No, good for him.
Yeah, so he's put in 40 years. He's ready to be done.
Hi, Director Schmidt. It looks like we've let her in. There she is.
Chairman.
How are you?
How are you today?
Good.
Good.
Sorry we held you up here a little bit. Larson got going, and you know how that. Yeah, I'll try to do better this afternoon.
Well, I think it was a great conversation. So we needed to, this wasn't a waste of our time at all.
I don't think we got enough to start. Just 3 of us. Senator Bouchard, are you there? I see your picture. I don't think so. Director Schmidt, have you heard any more on a potential meeting with the tribes to discuss those budget changes?
Mr. Chairman, no, I believe the governor had one of his standing meetings with both tribes, and there was some conversation, and I can fill you in.
Okay.
We met with the governor and Emily last week to kind of get an update of activities associated with the contracts.
It won't be up here then.
No, I believe they are looking at an in-person meeting somewhere around the beginning of December.
Yeah. Senator Kinski, I think we've got enough people. I see you're connecting back up to audio, but looks like we've got enough people to go ahead and get started if you're okay with that.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. So I think, Elizabeth, we are live. If we're back on streaming at least, is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So committee, we'd like to welcome Director Schmidt with Department of Family Services and her crew with us. Lindsay, it's nice to see you. We'll turn the time over to Director Schmidt to our first item here is to review that the adolescent mental health and substance abuse disorder services. And so I think that would probably go along. You give us an updated handout this morning, and then it looks like we're going to go to your screen. Who's running the show, Chairman or Director Schmidt, you or Mrs. Schilling?
Mr. Chairman, I'm taking the first part, and then Ms. Schilling will take the second part.
Thank you. It's yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, and members of the committee. My name is Corin Schmidt, and I'm the Director of the Department of Family Services. Today, I have with me Lindsay Schilling, who is the Senior Administrator for the Social Services Division, and that's the division that's responsible for the numerous treatment and services that are provided to children and families involved with DFS. Also, I have Dale Weber and Gary Gilmore, I think, has also joined us. If you'd like to show your picture, Dale and Gary. They are the superintendent and assistant superintendent at the Wyoming Boys School, which is located in Worland, Wyoming. And last, we have Chris Jones, who's the superintendent of the Wyoming Girls School, which is located in Sheridan. A few pieces of housekeeping. Mr. Chairman, you remarked about the updated system overview. It's a handout that we provided. We made a few corrections to it. Also, per the committee's request, there are two documents regarding the boys' school and the girls' school, which describes the services that are provided there. And then last, just as an additional piece of information, we provided an adolescent behavioral health complex cases brief. And this is a document that we shared with members of the Joint Labor, Health, and Social Services Committee at their last meeting. Before I get too far into it, I really want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk about adolescent behavioral health. It is something that I think is just as complicated, if not more, than the conversation you had this morning regarding outpatient mental health and substance abuse services provided by community mental health and substance abuse centers. just to quickly go back to that conversation, I wanted to make a plug for the services provided to not just adolescents through that system, but also the families that are involved with DFS, the parents of children who are removed from the home because of abuse and neglect. The majority of children who are removed from the home are removed because of neglect. And of that, that comes with mental health and substance abuse issues. So I would ask you, as you think about those population buckets, that in addition to the population bucket called adolescent health, behavioral health, you also think about a bucket called families involved with DFS. And most of the families that we're involved with come to us because of court actions. So you hit on it a little bit with the court action conversation, but I noticed in the document that was brought up that showed what the conversation was with WAMSAC and the Department of Health, that there were some more specific components around DFS populations, and just maybe thinking about carrying those over into the conversation you'll continue to have around community mental health and substance abuse services provided by those contracts.
Duly noted.
Thank you. So the agenda today, and Lindsay's going to be steering so that I can see all of you. But today I want to do my best to provide a system overview and to describe what is that a system that includes multiple needs, the who, both children and families, multiple service types of providers, including out-of-home placements, and that's the what. And then the how, which involves multiple agencies, multiple funding sources, multiple court systems sometimes, and multiple laws and regulations.
So Director Schmidt, do you want us to interrupt you as you go along, or would you like us to wait till the end of the presentation to ask questions?
I'm fine with either.
Okay, committee. So if anyone has a question, and Mr. Co-Chairman, if you see somebody I'm missing, if you'd let me know, please, and we'll just address the questions as we go along.
So, Mr. Chairman, after we cover the system overview, we'll talk briefly about the holes in the system, and then the so what, some of the activities that we're organizing to address the so what. So, the next slide. The slides that we'll be showing you today somewhat follow the order of the conversation in your system overview about adolescent behavioral health. The handout is more detailed than what we'll do, so it describes a little bit better some of the nuances of the system. But for the most part, if you're looking at the document and following the slides, they should pretty much fall in the same order. So who are we talking about? As we tried to think about organizing this conversation, we broke it into buckets of populations, services, and then payers. And this conversation really was kicked off very well in a joint labor meeting where Representative Clem had provided an overview of the payer system and the children's system, and tried to describe in a chart format, and you'll see that chart format coming up, who pays for what and when. So today, while there was a large conversation about adults, and I made the plug about families, really today we're talking about adolescents, mostly adolescents, but sometimes we see younger children needing these services as well. So in this conversation, adolescents are minors. And it's not a monolithic population. There's different diagnoses, whether it's educational, behavioral, or clinical. There's a lot of dual diagnosis that we'll talk about, sometimes educational and mental health related. And then age. The issue about age and developmental level is really important because when it comes time to deciding the most appropriate placement for these children, certainly age is a big component of appropriateness, and then also the level of care, the needs of the child. Also in the conversation, something to remember is who has custody of these adolescents. Is custody still with the parents or the caregiver, or has custody been given to the state, placed into DFS for placement? And those custody conversations are important because it oftentimes separates out a lot of who's eligible for what services under what payer source. So what are the services? We'll talk about the services in 3 basic settings. Outpatient, which is a lot of the conversation you had this morning. That's where a child's at home and services are provided to that child and family, most typically in a clinician's office, sometimes in the family home itself. But they're basically at home with family receiving outpatient services. Then residential is when it's a higher level of care and a child is placed in a facility that's on a campus, and that's where the child lives. Or inpatient, which is a much more restrictive level. It's medical and clinical, and that's usually in some sort of psychiatric facility or psychiatric residential treatment facility. And then we talk about services from the type. We have educational services. So as part of a child's IEP, they may be receiving some sort of service, mental health service related to their IEP because of educational purposes. Perhaps they're behavioral. It's to address behavioral issues that may or may not have something to do with mental health or substance abuse issues, but certainly it's the behavioral issues that have come to the attention and need to be treated. Clinical, which then is a formal diagnosis, there's been an evaluation, a level of care has been determined, and then there's a treatment plan or clinical plan that ensues. And then correctional, which is just what it sounds like. It's detention for adolescents. And oftentimes detention does not necessarily come with mental health services. It can if the detention facility provides them. But it's not a therapeutic setting. It's strictly for the safety of the child or for the community.
Where all do we have those in the state? The correctional ones for adolescents?
For adolescents, the primary detention facility for juveniles is in Casper. It's the juvenile detention facility. Regional Juvenile Detention Center, I think is the accurate name. And then there are some county jails that will accept juveniles. So for specific purposes of juvenile detention, we have it in Casper, but there are community county sheriff's departments that will take adolescents, have sight and sound separation and meet requirements to house children, youth, adolescents in their detention center.
And the boys' school.
And then the boys' school and the girls' school, which is somewhat correctional, but it's also residential in that it's on a campus environment and that education's provided. So looking at the next slide, you'll see the services, and these are lined out in the left-hand column.
Corinne?
Yes.
Corinne, so go to that Casper. I guess I hadn't understood the Casper thing. So I had assumed that the boys' school and the girls' school were detention.
Yeah.
I had thought the one in Casper was just sort of a short-term deal. What's the longest that a student would go there?
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I don't know what the length of stay at a juvenile detention center would be. I know that they like to limit those, but a juvenile detention center is just like jail. The boys' school and the girls' school, however, I think you could kind of compare it to more of the Honor Farm or Newcastle's boot camp. It's not as secure as Rollins or even Torrington, but it's for placement after the fact, after the child's been adjudicated in Title 14. And I'll explain that a little bit more detail here in a second.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. Sorry to hear that.
No problem, thank you. So on the left-hand side, you can see the services that are based through the continuum of care as we recognize it for adolescents. It starts with the least restrictive, which are community-based, and goes to the most restrictive to get to your point, Senator Kinsky, which is a juvenile detention center. In between are a variety of services, and the services that are provided are oftentimes based on funding source or eligibility of the child. So to start at the first one, mental health and substance abuse services that are provided on an outpatient basis. A lot of these services are provided by the community mental health and substance abuse centers. However, there's also private practitioners in many communities that accept Medicaid and or accept private payment. There's also a group of providers that we really didn't discuss or you didn't mention in the previous conversation that the adolescent behavioral health system relies heavily on, and that's the youth serving facilities or the youth serving providers. And many of your communities have a youth service provider. They provide some outpatient services through mentoring, through parenting, maybe some outpatient clinical services. But they also provide, some of them provide an array from outpatient all the way up to a residential treatment center level of care. They're a combination of for-profit and nonprofit providers. And I'll go through each of the levels of care a little bit more and kind of highlight who provides what. So in the next level is crisis stabilization services. We are funded with state general fund and we use federal funding match, TANF dollars, to provide to communities access to emergency services that can be overnight for a night or a few for adolescents who are maybe experiencing some sort of crisis. So it may be a family crisis, it may be their own mental health crisis, but it's a place where families can safely place their children in a limited stay and services can be provided. The child still goes to school at their regular school and the child does not need to be in state custody to access these services. The way that these services are set up, it really is a community-based service available to all who need it at the right age levels.
So give me an example of that.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in your community, you have crisis services through the Fremont County Group Home and through the Wind River Group Home. So many of the group homes also provide crisis services.
I guess what I was asking is just give me an idea of the situation because it's voluntary. So is this a parent and child that recognize that there's some challenges going on and in the best interest of both parties, they reach out to this facility? Or I'm just trying to understand. I understand the group home and how it works, but I'm just trying to understand this crisis portion of it.
Mr. Chairman, yes, exactly. If there's some sort of dynamic going on at the home where the child needs a timeout, families need a break from a child, this is an option, optional services that's available in many of the communities. Sometimes schools may suggest it. Law enforcement may encounter a child that's picked up and maybe a runaway, and rather than taking the child home, takes the child to the crisis center, then the crisis center contacts families, and then they work to reunify that family. From a family services standpoint and from a Title 14 standpoint, which is the juvenile court, we see crisis stabilization services as a prevention for children coming into state custody. So if a parent can safely place their child in a crisis with a crisis service, and it's through the coordination of services with family, with the school, and with the child. If that prevents a child from coming into care, then we see that as a big win. And that's really what we like to see the system used for. It's community-based services. Those providers know what's available. They know how to tap into the numerous resources. And then they do their best to work with the child and with the family so that children can go home quickly and that children can stay at home. Moving to the next level of care, and that's the Board of Cooperative Education Service, BOCES. And in the state, we have 3 BOCES providers that are residential, and they take children with educational needs and with behavioral needs. I believe all 3 provide residential-based services for educational purposes, oftentimes for children with really high needs. So that's in Gillette, Thermopolis, and in Jackson. Sometimes DFS will utilize these providers, but more times than not, they're utilized by local school districts. And that's a whole other discussion, educational discussion that I think has been had numerous times in the past.
Corinne?
Mr.
Go ahead,
Co-
Senator Kinski.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. So BOCES is it's a mill levy, and it has to be, for anything over a half mil, it has to be approved by a vote of the voters. So this BOCES service is limited to just those counties, those three, Teton, and some others that have funded it. What's the counties that have not elected to establish a BOCES? Where does their funding for students with behaviors and qualifying educational support needs come from? Is that coming out of the general fund, out of the school foundation program? Do you know?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, no, I do not know then what those districts, how they provide those services to those kids.
But do you,
Mr. Co-Chair,
please,
I'd ask if we could have a follow-up on that. It seems unfair to the counties that have not established a BOCES if that funding's come out of the general fund or out of the school foundation program. There's a bit of an inequity there. I'd just like to understand that stream better, and I don't quite know who to ask about that. That's all, Mr. Chairman. If Corinne can get us more information, I'd appreciate it.
excuse me, Senator Schuler.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to give you, Senator Kinski, just a little follow-up, a little bit that I know. In our county, we do have a BOCES, but we don't have a facility like the ranch up in Jackson. So we do have some students that end up going there, but we also have another program that has only been in existence a couple of years, and it's sort of an alternative school, but it's provided through the BOCES mill money, and it's under the auspices of our school district as well. So I don't think any of the money comes out of the general fund for it, but it's been a nice alternative rather than sending kids all the way up to Jackson. We actually have a facility in our community that takes care of those high needs kids. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please.
Thank you. So I would ask Senator Schuler, then the students that do go to Jackson out of your county, Jackson must be getting reimbursed out of the BOCES mill levy. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Mr.
Sheila.
Chairman, thank you. I believe they get funds from both, from our BOCES, local BOCES, and I think our school district as well. Both provide some funding for those students that end up going up there.
Thank you.
And Co-Chairman Kinski, I believe that if one of our students from Fremont County #1 goes to one of the BOCES, they have to pay them for that education. That's the reimbursement they get. They have to pay them for the room, board, and services, which is a little bit different than if it's placed out of DFS. And my question.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, I get that, but following up on what Senator Schuler said, she thinks it's paid partly through the BOCES and partly through the school district. Effectively, the school district funding is general funding anymore, and if it's not, it soon will be. So if some school districts are taking it out of their resources, whether it comes from the school foundation program or, well, it comes out of the school foundation program that gets refilled from a variety of sources, more and more of the general fund. It doesn't seem fair to those counties that are fully carrying the cost of BOCES, but there must be a formula of some kind, and we can get more information on that. I don't want to get us too distracted from the larger cause. It'd be nice to have some more information on it.
And Director Smith, does DFS utilize BOCES facilities, or do you just, when you place them through your process of court adjudication, do they go to the RTCs or the PRTFs?
Mr. Chairman, we will use BOCES for placements if we have a child that has behavioral health and intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. The decision on where to place a child really comes from a group of professionals who know the child and then make recommendations to the judge. And occasionally we do place at a BOCES. It's not as frequent as placing children at a residential treatment center. But when we do place out of BOCES, then the court-ordered placement statutes take place, which is, for the purposes of DFS, we see BOCES as a placement option. I think for purposes of education, it's a little bit of a different animal. But we can certainly work with the Department of Education to get some more information about how educational placements are made and paid for if it's for a school district outside of the county that's assessing the mill levy.
Thank you. Continue, please.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, next is our group homes. And group homes are placements available for children in state custody. And this is a low level of care for children who maybe do not need a high level of residential intervention, but rather aren't ready to go home. Home may not be ready for the child to come back. Oftentimes this can be used as a step down from a higher level of care. But children placed in group homes go to regular school. They receive outpatient mental health services. And there could be a potential private placement made there, but that would be an agreement then between the parent and the provider and whatever funding source that pays for that child. Residential treatment centers are residential. Now we're going up the line. It's behavioral and clinical. The child lives on a campus, and in that campus, they receive their educational services. So through an agreement with the Department of Education, typically education services are paid for through Department of Ed. Department of Family Services pays for room and board. And then Medicaid will pay for outpatient type services. Medicaid can't pay residential treatment centers in the way that it pays for psychiatric residential treatment facilities. It's a different level of care. So oftentimes residential treatment centers enroll in Medicaid as a provider. And then when they provide some sort of clinical service to a child that's on their campus, they will bill Medicaid for those services. Acute psychiatric stabilization is a hospital level of care. That's when you have an acute psychiatric issue with an adolescent that requires immediate attention. It's very high level and it's not intended for long-term. If a child needs long-term psychiatric care, then what becomes available is a psychiatric residential treatment facility, a PRTF. And a PRTF requires a diagnosis and admission by a medical physician or a medical provider. It has to have a doctor saying that this level of care is appropriate for this child. And then we kind of go into the boys' school and the girls' school, which from a juvenile detention or from a juvenile delinquency standpoint is a high level of care, but it doesn't really fall in line with treatment. So the boys' school and the girls' school are both operated by the Department of Family Services. Their budget exists in our budgets, and they receive children who've been adjudicated as delinquent under Title 14. And Title 14 is something that's very specific to DFS, and I'll get to that in just a second. But the Wyoming Boys School, the Wyoming Girls School are for high level offenders on the sanction level. They're placed at the Boys School and the Girls School for services, educational services primarily, and they also receive a milieu of behavioral services. In addition to both Boys School and Girls School have provider agreements with local mental health professionals that provide mental health services on campus. So the campus is not necessarily secure, but certainly adolescents placed at the Wyoming Boys School and the Wyoming Girls School are not free to roam. If there's a runaway situation, then that's something that we bring law enforcement in. And then the juvenile detention centers are really just that highest, most restrictive level of care, and it's for children who've committed crimes or who have been found guilty of committing crimes. Juvenile detention centers can also serve kids who have been charged in an adult court. So for example, if you have a misdemeanor of a youth that went through circuit court, that circuit court judge can order that child to a juvenile detention center, and that child may or may not ever come to the attention of DFS. So it's a little bit bigger in the population that it serves versus the boys' school and the girls' school, which is specific to the Title 14 statutes.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please go ahead, Senator Kinski, and then I've got a question.
Thank you. Corinne, that was good. Thank you. And so that last comment that, you know, a judge sends a kid off to a juvenile detention center and may or may not come to DFS's attention. I assume DFS is paying the bill. And so it's sort of a question I have on all of these levels. We just leave this up to judges, county judges and district court judges, or is there some triage where somebody who's responsible for footing the bill says, wait a minute, why are you sending this one to the girls' school? You know, everything we see in this case, a group home setting ought to be appropriate. Who makes sure that these people are considering the most cost-effective option in all of these instances? Do you have a say-so, or does the court order it and you just have to write a check?
Mr. Chairman?
Please.
Mr. Co-Chairman, when a youth is ordered to a juvenile detention center through the circuit court, the county pays. So that's not a DFS charge unless the child's in our care and custody. So the county, of course, has then a lot of stake in who's placed into their juvenile detention centers. The juvenile justice system has a single point of entry where many of those decisions are made by the local county attorney. So the charge is reviewed, and then the local county attorney makes a determination of whether a child should be charged in an adult court like circuit court, or whether that there should be a petition filed in juvenile court, which then will bring them more into the DFS system.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please.
So again, excluding juvenile detention centers, who's looking over the shoulder of the county attorney and the single point of entry folks to look at their determinations in sort of a, I guess for want of a better word, a utilization management role to say, wait a minute, you know, we don't think this, and I assume that there's differences amongst them as to how many of them go to the more expensive treatment settings and how many of them manage to divert them off to least expensive or lesser expensive settings. Do you have any oversight, or once the county attorney makes that decision or the MDT makes that decision and the judge agrees, you just have to start writing the checks, is that right? Or do you have any kind of utilization say?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, so when a county attorney, and I think I'm going to try to answer your question, so stop me if I'm not getting there. When a county attorney makes a decision about where to charge the case, they can charge it in one of the, the adult courts, circuit court or district court, or they can file a petition in juvenile court. And there's 3 actions associated with juvenile court. There's abuse and neglect actions, child need of supervision action, and a juvenile delinquency action. If the judge accepts the case under Title 14, under the juvenile court statutes, then that opens the door then to what you just referenced as the multidisciplinary team. So the judge can then appoint a multidisciplinary team, which consists of, it's supposed to consist of professionals who have knowledge of the child and the child's case. So it can be education, a mental health therapist if there's one in place, the DFS worker, the county attorney. In some cases, guardian ad litems are appointed. In some cases, parents' attorneys are appointed, depending on what kind of case it is. So in a juvenile delinquency, and I may start to get out of my depth here, so I'll look to people to message me to let me know if I'm on or not. But the MDT will look at what's going on with that youth and make a recommendation to the court about what they think is the best placement or disposition. So the MDT may recommend placement at a residential treatment center if the child has more of a therapeutic need and a behavioral need. They may suggest a group home if there isn't a lot of issues, but certainly the child or the family need a break from each other. Oftentimes, if a child that's on probation through the juvenile delinquency statutes violates probation, then certainly jail could be ordered, the juvenile detention center, or the boys' school or the girls' school. So once you bifurcate the system, once that decision's made, whether it's an adult court system or juvenile court system, the adult court system then I think just occurs, there's some diversion programming available in some communities, and we'll touch on that at the very end of the presentation. Or they come into the larger juvenile court system, which involves a lot of attorneys, therapists, educators, DFS, et cetera. So did I get it?
We can't hear you, Senator. Senator Kinski, for some reason, we're not hearing you.
I think you did, Corinne, with the exception that I didn't hear that your department, the one writing the checks, is at any point consulted as an opportunity to weigh in on what's the most appropriate placement and how much money would be spent. And it sounds like you're not involved. We trust the MDTs and the judge to arrive at the best solution.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
And Mr. Co-Chairman, we are a member of the MDT, so our recommendations are made. We're part of the group that makes the recommendations, and yes, we ultimately, in combination with the Department of Ed and the Department of Health, pay for the services then provided to that child and family. So we do have some say. However, if there's no money in the system for that placement, we also have statutory authority to stand up and say there is no money, we can't pay for this placement. In my experience, that has not happened, but certainly it's part of the court order placement statutes that allows for that if we get to a place where we've expended all of our funds.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I think Representative Wilson has her hands up.
She does indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. But so Corinne, just to be clear, you would only be paying if the child ends up in state custody, right? I mean, I would assume that many, maybe most of cases where a youth is, let's say, arrested for, whatever, burning down his classroom or something, or whatever, that they're not in DFS custody. They're still in their parents' custody. And so then I suppose the county pays for them to go off to wherever, like any other person who is an adult who is found to be a criminal. So what percentage of youth who end up in a sort of a court-ordered situation end up in DFS custody?
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
Representative Wilson, if I can I maybe restate that to see if I understand it correctly? Are you talking about all children that come to the attention of the legal system, or children who come to the attention of the juvenile court system?
Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I guess what I'm thinking of is that Senator Kinski has expressed a concern that that minors who end up being sent off to a detention center or a group home, that no one is consulting DFS and you are paying for it. But unless they're in state custody beforehand, just because they end up in some sort of correction, I mean, so are you saying that, I mean, I guess perhaps I'm confusing the idea of custody, but I mean, when, are we talking custody in the sense of like you're a prisoner in the custody of Rollins, or that your parents have lost parental authority over you? Could we just clarify that? Because I guess I'm not understanding.
Director Schmidt.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Wilson, yeah, I think custody, it's important that we have this conversation, and this comes to Title 14. So when a juvenile or a child who's been suspected of abuse or neglect, or a child who's in need of supervision, a CHINS, which means that they're incorrigible, maybe have truancy issues, what we see more than not have mental health issues, a county attorney can petition the court to bring that case into juvenile court. So there's the 3 court actions: abuse and neglect, CHINS, and juvenile delinquents. So the county attorney makes a decision, and there's a lot of ways that the case can come to the attention of the county attorney's office. Law enforcement can bring it, DFS may bring it, the schools may bring it, but the county attorney has to make a decision about what to do with the case. If the county attorney decides to file that in juvenile court, then all of the laws and requirements around juvenile court start to take hold. So in any of those situations, the court may decide to take custody of the child. So in an abuse and neglect case, they may take custody of the children and place them with us, and then we turn around and decide what's the most appropriate placement. Usually foster care is what we like to do, home foster care first. More specifically with relatives. If it's a child in needed supervision, they may need a placement, some level of psychiatric placement or residential treatment placement, or a delinquent. So a delinquent could go on probation, or if the MDT makes a decision that maybe the delinquent needs to go to some sort of higher level of care, and then the services that are on the screen start to play in. But the importance of a child coming into state custody means that it opens the door to DFS money. So if a child's not in state custody, if you have that juvenile delinquent that's charged in circuit court, they really don't have a lot of access to resources beyond detention and a fine, maybe some probation. But that's one of the issues with having a child in the adult system, is that there just isn't a lot of resources available. If they come into the juvenile court system, then they become Medicaid eligible if they're removed from the home, which is a huge component. They're Medicaid eligible. And then they also have access to the dollars that are given to us to serve that child and family. Sometimes the child will stay at home, but there's still jurisdiction of the juvenile court over that family. Did that explain things a little bit better? Great. Okay, Mr. Chairman, shall I go on?
Yep.
So funding, and we hit on this a little bit. So this is where I was going to give you my Title 14 description, but I think you have hopefully enough context now to talk.
Director Schmidt, before we completely leave that, and it goes back to Senator Kinski's point, when you aren't aware of that somebody's being placed in a juvenile detention center, is that a problem, or do you just say, oh, that's good and life is, or is that something that comes back and bites us once in a while? It seems like you would know that.
Mr. Chairman, you know, in so many of our communities, they're small enough that I think there's a lot of conversations between the county attorneys and DFS, but we do have some situations where you have minors that commit serious crimes that are going to go to detention. And in those situations, it really is up to the county attorney to determine what's the best place to serve that youth, whether that's in an adult criminal court, or that's through a juvenile court, which is more family-centered, typically has rehabilitation in mind. So it really is the discretion of the county attorney. And depending on the community, we may or may not know about it. The conversation that I think would need to be had is really around juvenile justice. And this has been something that's been discussed for years and years and years about how many kids are being charged in adult courts, and are they afforded all of the opportunities that they would otherwise have in a juvenile court. And one of the solutions to that was that single point of entry, so that the county attorney is making those decisions. So there's consistency in application of the laws, rather than perhaps it just kids showing up in municipal court and kids showing up in circuit court. So Wyoming is a little bit different in that our juvenile justice system is kind of bifurcated. It shows up in our adult court system, and then it shows up in our juvenile court system, which is where DFS plays a major role.
Thank you.
So going into funding, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, court-ordered placements is a place where you see the Department of Health, the Department of Family Services, and the Department of Education get together to pay for the placement of a child. So for children in DFS custody, so they're under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court, the statute provides for the coverage of RTCs, residential treatment centers, group homes, day treatment, and juvenile detention facilities for kids in our custody. DFS pays room and board, education pays education, and then Medicaid typically pays the medical costs. The reason why Medicaid is such a big player in this is because, again, when a child comes into the custody of the state, that child is considered to be in foster care and therefore is eligible for Medicaid services. That's statute 21-13-315. Also, 21-13-336 is the medical necessary Medicaid placements, and those are for psychiatric residential treatment facilities. It's Medicaid pays for the room and board and the treatment, but works with the Department of Education to cover education costs. DFS does not pay for anything when it comes to a psychiatric residential treatment facility placement. And then there are community-based services. Those include the Community Mental Health Substance Abuse Center contracts that were discussed previously this morning. There's some funding from DFS that goes to some providers for parents who may not qualify for Medicaid or don't have a payment source, and then Medicaid for for any of the children in our care.
Warren, could you go back and say that there was some part there on the PRTFs that you said didn't get reimbursed?
Mr. Chairman, DFS does not pay for any of the PRTF services. It's a Medicaid paid for service and a Department of Ed paid for service. So in that situation, placements do not come out of our budget.
So on your court-ordered placements, the first one you talked about, where Medicaid covers that through foster care, the majority of those would be 4E eligible for reimbursement, I'm assuming. And then take me down with a similar question on the PRTF side of that. Are those Medicaid covered expenses reimbursable or not?
So, Mr. Chairman, to go to the court-ordered placements, the 4E funding that you mentioned is federal funding that we receive for foster care. And in order for us to receive 4E reimbursement, the child must first be 4E eligible, which is a financial criteria, and then the service must be 4E reimbursable.
So if they're not in a foster home, then they're ineligible.
Mr. Chairman, foster care under the federal term is used broader. It's for kids in care, really. Okay. And so you can have a placement in a residential treatment center, and if the child's 4E eligible and that service is a 4E eligible service, the room and board, we can get reimbursed for a portion of those dollars. 4E is a whole other discussion. We do not have very many kids that are eligible because of the financial criteria. So 4E, our state does not collect a lot of 4E funds for services to children. Our state does collect 4E funds for our administrative costs, but that's a different criteria. So basically, we hover around 30% of the kids that come into our care are 4E eligible, which isn't a whole lot. When you get to higher levels of care, like a group home and a residential treatment center, that number drops. In terms of, Mr. Chairman, the Medicaid PRTF placement, that is a Medicaid placement. And so Medicaid does receive federal reimbursement for the services that are provided to that child.
At our state rate or an enhanced rate?
Mr. Chairman, at the state rate, but I believe that they can also discuss with the particular provider any enhanced rates if necessary.
Okay. Thank you.
And then at the last is that insurance status and custody status really, funding really then is dictated by where the child's living, whether the child's living at home or whether the child's in state custody. And then if the child's at home, what kind of insurance do they have and the benefits do they receive? So in this, you have the whole gamut of adolescents, not just those that are somehow state or Medicaid involved. Okay. So for those of you on joint labor, this is going to probably look a little familiar. We took the information that Representative Clem had provided and we broke it out into a few different slides to kind of show you from a visual who pays for what when. So under this scenario, a child has been placed via the court-ordered placement statutes. And then you can see at a glance who pays for what. So the black marks mean that that column, that payer in that column does not provide that service. So if a child comes into DFS custody, DFS, and there should, DFS will pay for room and board at a BOCES. Medicaid will pay for outpatient treatments, and education pays for education. The same thing with residential treatment centers. You can go across and see who are the payer sources for that service. PRTFs, that just gets at the conversation we were having. It's Medicaid pays for the medical services and the care of the child, whereas Department of Education pays for education. Boys school and girls school, the department picks up 100% of the tab, except Medicaid does pay for medical services provided to that child. But this is a kicker. That child's not eligible for federal reimbursement. So even though Medicaid is the payer source, they use 100% state general fund. That placement's not eligible for match.
You lost me on that.
So, Mr. Chairman, the boys' school and the girls' school are considered correctional placements. And under Medicaid, Medicaid cannot pay or cannot seek federal reimbursement for services provided at a correctional placement. So even though Medicaid pays for that service, they are using 100% of their state general fund to provide it.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please.
So the child, because they're in custody, is Medicaid eligible, but the services are not reimbursable because of what they call the corrections exception on Medicaid. They won't pay for any Medicaid services for somebody who's in a correctional facility. So because the girls' school and the boys' school are categorized as correctional, we can't get reimbursement. If they were a residential treatment center,
right,
or a PRTF, we could seek Medicaid reimbursement.
Right. What I heard Director Schmidt saying is Medicaid will pays for that, but because it's correctional, they don't. And just maybe better said was the services qualify for Medicaid payment, but because it's a correctional institution, we have to pay for it out of general fund. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So going back up there, Director Schmidt, to your PRTFs, who is Medicaid paying for room and board as well?
Mr. Chairman, yes.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, just one clarification under the RTCs and the psychiatric residential treatment facilities. When we say WDE, sometimes the local district will also pay. There's statutes that say who pays depending on the agreement between the Department of Ed, and the local school district, and who provides the services. So there is a little bit more nuance to that educational column than I'm explaining. But the point is that DFS doesn't pay for education and Medicaid doesn't pay for education, that either the school district or the Department of Ed pays for education.
So what's the black?
Mr. Co-Chair.
Go ahead, Co-Chairman Kinski.
So Corinne, under crisis stabilization and acute psychiatric, there's no payer source listed. What is the funding source for that?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, these are just for children that are placed under the court order placement statutes.
Okay.
So what that means is that those the levels of care are available, but they're going to come because of a different custody issue or a different legal issue.
So other than a court ordered placement, I got you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we can go to the next slide. Okay, so medically necessary Medicaid placements. This is when a child is on Medicaid and needs either acute psychiatric stabilization or psychiatric residential treatment facility level of care. And so when it's medically necessary under the statute, these are the services that are available, and this is who pays.
So who pays the education portion on the acute psychiatric stabilization?
Mr. Chairman, typically there isn't education provided because it's supposed to be a short-term stay. It should be a stabilization, not a long-term placement.
So let's think of perhaps a situation that could possibly arise where maybe you would have a temporary stay of a juvenile in maybe a state facility where education isn't funded for crisis stabilization. Let's just say a 75-day stay. And then is education required to be provided? It's a short-term stay, or is there a definition on length of stay before education is required?
Mr. Chairman, I do not know the answer to that question, but I can certainly work with the Department of Ed to find out. So educational services in a crisis placement?
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand what the requirements are, because I think you could get into a predicament depending on where you place that child, that you're not providing them the services that they're expected. So perhaps you're putting them into an institution because you're denying them their education, free and appropriate education needs. And so I'm just trying to understand, is that the local school district and how that, or the individual school district, let's just say that it come from Sheridan to another place? Would it be the Sheridan district because this child is a member of their district that pays for that? Is it, just trying to understand that a little more, and then when it really is necessary. Chairman Wilson, please. You're on mute, Sue.
Sorry, went the wrong direction. You may want to have Director Schmidt answer that first, because mine is a different question. I'm just want to be clear here that these are only children who are on Medicaid. I mean, if the family's income is, $70,000 a year, and whether they have insurance or not, so the child doesn't just suddenly become eligible for Medicaid when they need a psychiatric hospitalization. If the family is not, if they're not a Medicaid child, then the family and their physician they're having to find these treatment facilities themselves, right?
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
Representative Wilson, correct. So who we haven't talked about are children whose families have insurance or maybe have no insurance, but they don't qualify for Medicaid, which at the end of the conversation comes back around to some of the issues that we have with high needs children with behavioral health placements. There's lack of services and lack of funding. Mr. Chairman, just a comment about your question around the role of the school district. Education is required for longer term stays. This is according to Shelley Hamill at the Department of Education. However, depending on how the child's placed, the district, there'll have to be a conversation with the district about whether the district pays and how how those services, educational services are provided. So it comes back to the district.
So did Mrs. Hamill give you any idea on the length of time before that becomes applicable?
Mr. Chairman, what she said that there's no definition of length of stay.
Okay. And that's fair. Thank you. Thanks, Mrs. Hamill.
And then to the larger point, Mr. Chairman, these are private placements. So if my son needed services, this is what would be available to me as a parent. Room and board for crisis stabilization, the schools would continue to pay the services. If my insurance plan allowed, they could bill outpatient services for anything that they provided that qualifies. And that's available locally. The reason why local is yes on here is because this particular service is already paid for by DFS and it's open to anyone. So it's a local service that the Department of Family Service provides money for local providers to give to kids. So it's very much local. If you look through the rest of this chart, private insurance policies dictate what services are allowed and what services we can access.
Senator Schuler, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Director Schmidt, when I looked at this slide, and maybe I just don't understand, but I figured if they had private insurance, why would DFS still have to pay room and board at the crisis stabilization services? Is that because they may have put them up there themselves, right? The parent. I mean, they may have placed them, not necessarily court. Is there a reason for that? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schuler, it goes back to the general philosophy that we want to have those services available to everyone no matter what. And so we don't determine eligibility based on an income scale. That service is open to all community members. However, we do ask for some basic financial information because half of those services are paid for with TANF money. So we do ask for it, but it's not a criteria for accessing it.
So Director Schmidt, it seems to me in our budget conversations that we reserve beds in not days. So those beds are being paid for and they're available irregardless. Is that not correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Carry on, please.
Okay. So next slide, please, Lindsay. So what are the holes in the system? So the DFS complex cases are the high need youth for whom no appropriate placement can be secured regardless of the state's ability to pay. And this is where we struggle. We have about 12 to 14 cases a year where we cannot find a placement for a child because maybe their age, their needs, their behavioral needs, their mental health needs. And while the state may have funding to pay for this, there's no provider that will take them, whether that provider be in-state or out of state. So the complex cases often come with multiples of issues. It's usually some sort of dual or multiple diagnosis of mental health, maybe intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities. They may have committed a crime. And oftentimes these children come into our care through a child in need of supervision petition. So sometimes when a family has exhausted all of their own resources, their private resources, they may go to the county attorney and ask that a petition be filed as a child in need of supervision. And then literally they're giving up custody to the state in order for the state to be able to secure services for that child. One of the biggest difficulties we have in this area is that everyone can tell us no. So unlike Title 25, where there's an institution that is designed strictly for people with severe mental health needs to go get treatment, in the adolescent and child system, we rely on a private provider system, whether it's in-state or out of state, and even our own 2 facilities, the boys' school and the girls' school. All those facilities can tell us no. They can say, we don't have enough room, the child doesn't meet the age requirements, we can't provide that level of service. It may be cost prohibitive in that that child needs such a high level of services that it's hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So this is something where we're working with a group of stakeholders and providers and partners to talk about how do we best serve these children. And this was a conversation we had with folks, with committee members on joint labor. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out the best place for these kids. Unfortunately, they oftentimes end up in juvenile detention because we just cannot find anybody where those children can be safe, whether they're a harm to self or a harm to others. It's not therapeutic. It's awfully hard on the detention facilities because they're not equipped to take care of severe mental health or behavioral needs. But at the end of the day, DFS can't serve these children in our offices. We really do have to find a provider, and providers can tell us no. Another hole in the system is that it's more of a prevention orientation. Somebody had mentioned Family First a little bit earlier. At this time, we do not receive any federal money for reimbursement for services for families outside of our care. So if we're working voluntarily with a family, there is no court order, there's no court involvement, but they need our help. We then pay 100% state general fund for those services. And we do not have a lot of money to do that. In fact, in 2016, as part of those budget reductions, prevention services were eliminated. And again, you'll hear from Lindsay Schilling, we've also had to eliminate some prevention services for delinquents as a result of the most recent budget reductions. Funding for step-down services for Medicaid youth, it doesn't exist. So if a child's not in DFS custody, but the child's Medicaid eligible and they're at a PRTF, the only option is discharge to home or community. Medicaid does not pay for residential treatment centers. And if the child is not in our care, then there's no payer source. Certainly parents can pay. However, if you're on Medicaid, chances are you can't afford a private placement. And then I mentioned already the adolescents with behavioral challenges that are placed in detention. Again, not a huge population, 12 to 14, but certainly one where we just really, on every single case, has to do our best to piecemeal the services together so that we hope to find an appropriate place for that child to get treated.
Director Schmidt, could you go back if you would, Lindsay, thanks. That funding for step-down services, I don't think I caught that very well. Would you explain that one to me again, please?
So, Mr. Chairman, if a child's in a psychiatric residential treatment facility, that medically necessary level of care, and they're ready for discharge, there isn't a Medicaid payment option of a residential treatment center unless the child's in our care. So if it's just a private Medicaid placement. Okay. Yeah. So again, the incentive then is to have the child be in our care so that that service can be accessed. And
let me shift gears just a little bit and ask you for some examples to help the committee understand. So what I've heard with my involvement in some of this issue over the last couple of years is this number of 12 to 14 individuals are across the state, and we have what I would call young adolescents who oftentimes are being placed in detention facilities. Is that fair? And for an extended period of time because we can't find a place for them. So if you'd confirm that and then guide us through the process is that for options available from that point, if we have nobody in the state, so if we have an autistic individual, then we start looking at out-of-states placements. the challenges there sometimes are, will they take Wyoming Medicaid, or are they even appropriate for our children? Am I right in, am I catching that right? And if you could just kind of confirm, and I just think we need to have an understanding of how this is pretty big deal, really.
So, Mr. Chairman, one of the handouts that we provided was a complex cases brief. And if you turn to page 2, what you'll see is the characteristics of, this is just a sampling of what we've experienced over the past year. The age range is from 10 to 18. So yes, we have young kids that need these major interventions. Most of them need an RTC or a PRTF level of care. Oftentimes, our providers in state aren't equipped to take some of these children. And then when we start looking out of state, we run into some of the similar problems. Maybe our payment isn't substantial enough that a provider would take the child, or for whatever reason, the child doesn't meet their criteria. So this is very much a case by case. There's no systems approach to these children. It really is case dependent based on the needs. We've had older children that have been in and out of our own facilities, that go to hospitals, that eventually turn 18 and then are subject to Title 25. We have younger children where the child's not old enough for any of the types of care we provide in this state, and safety is paramount, and that child may spend some time in a juvenile detention center. So for these 12 to 14 kids, there just really is no system. There's just major holes in the services, and we do our best on a case by case to patch those holes and eventually hopefully find somewhere where they can be successful.
So can you tell me how, because it appears to me that we could very easily find the responsibility of these children lying between your Department of Education and Department of Health. And is there a system, a coordinated policy between those 3 state agencies to address these few number of children in a coordinated effort to find services for them? Tell me how you do that.
Mr. Chairman, one of the best ways that we found is that we hire Medicaid staff at the Department of Family Services who have knowledge of that system. Lindsay Schilling joined us from Medicaid, and so she's been a really big asset in being able to make all those connections between the Department of Ed and the Department of Health to secure a placement for this child. But no, we don't have a coordinated effort, so to speak. As I mentioned, there was a group of folks who have expressed a lot of interest in this high needs area. So we had an organizational meeting about a month ago and broke into work groups. There are 3 work groups then that will be tackling the issues surrounding these complex cases. The first are the policies, and I'll speak to that in just a second. And then the second group is what you mentioned. It's an organization of the payer sources to talk about what are the program policies that happen at each of the agencies, and is there a better way to organize those so that we can ultimately find a placement. It's not that nobody wants to help. It's just that these children come with such severe issues that finding a provider who can address those issues is usually our biggest challenge.
And so with that group, are we having the same question that this group is asking, which is, what is the state's role?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Lindsay, if you want to move to the next slide. So what is DFS doing? There are 3 work groups, as I mentioned: the system policy development, payer coordination, and juvenile detention. As a side note, we're working with group homes and RTCs. Lindsay, do you want to kick one more, please? And so what? This is really the policy conversation I think that you're getting at, Mr. Chairman, is who are the state's priority adolescent populations? And you went through the exercise just with community mental health and substance abuse services. And we think that that's a conversation maybe to have again, but for adolescent behavioral health needs. And what's the role of the state in ensuring access? And then how can those priority populations be funded? So we have options available to us. You know, we have money, we have not a lot, I don't mean to say that in terms of, but we do have funding sources that can help pay for these. It's a matter of finding what is the best option for these kids. We could rely solely on the private sector, meaning the private provider group, and look to incentivize them so that they can consistently serve these children in state. We could look at our own state-owned facilities across the state and develop a program that would hopefully meet the majority of needs. Or we can continue just struggling through every year with 12 to 14 kids looking for the best options and do a better job of coordinating those services, but somewhat maintain the same system we have now. And then the funding, that comes back to the incentivizing. Our private provider system isn't funded at a level to provide some of the services that these kids need. Some kids need 24-hour watching, maybe 2-on-1. And at the rates that we provide, that's not contemplated. So all of those are policy discussions that we'll be searching through. And I hope at some point we can bring recommendations back to this group or to the legislature in whatever form.
Thank you.
And that, Mr. Chairman, is really our conversation about adolescent behavioral health. I just appreciate the focused conversation. I know that we spend a lot of time talking about Title 25 and the needs of adults, but from a systems perspective, I believe that these services are more important and necessary as a way to prevent further entrance into the adult system, whether that be through Title 25 or correctional. But it does come with a lot of different players. It comes with payers, it comes with families, it comes with parents. There's a lot of advocates in this system, which requires a different level of coordination.
So, Director Smith, if you could again, let's just draw the scenario of somebody that would maybe need to be placed in a PRTF or a BOCES facility that could handle behavioral things that they didn't feel that they could adequately take care of the person. What does it cost the state to put these kids in Utah, Mississippi, Texas, New York, some of these other states where we've had to place kids? And is there a cost savings if we look at incentivizing being able to put them in Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to look to Lindsay to see if she can shed a little bit of light at the rates that we pay in out-of-state placements. But we have not done a comprehensive analysis of what would be the cheapest remedy. At this point, what we look for is who can take care of the child. We did encounter one case which was extremely cost prohibitive and then found an alternate placement at one of our state facilities, one of our state-owned facilities. But the placement of that youth would have been, I think, approximately $200,000 to $300,000 a year. We did not pay for that. The child stayed in state with some services. But as a whole, Lindsay, can you please, if you can, shed some light on the rates for out-of-state providers?
Certainly, Corin and Chairman. In terms of DFS placing in out-of-state facilities, we would look for residential treatment centers. And we do have several in Colorado that we use for specialty service programs, specifically like the Institute for Reactive Attachment Disorder down in Denver. And we do have to negotiate higher rates, but those rates usually land somewhere between $200 and $250 a day. So they are approximately $25 to $50 higher per day than our in-state RTC rates.
Okay. How many kids do we have placed out of state right now, Lindsay? How many Wyoming kids do we have out of state, and how many more? How many? We're saying we have 12 to 14 that we have no placement for right now. How many do we have placed out of state?
Chairman Larson, I don't have that number with me, but I can certainly get it to you. I know in pulling historical data, we were averaging between 10 and 15 children per year that DFS would be responsible for placing out of state. That would exclude PRTFs because we consider those PRTF placements to be Medicaid placements. So those would show up on the Medicaid side in their out of state child count.
Could we ask you to look at both of those, just because you come from that, down that trail, and kind of give us an idea of where that's at? See if Mrs. Green will be kind enough to share that with you.
Certainly.
Committee, any questions, any follow-up questions for Director Schmidt on where we're at right now? Okay, Corin, onward and upward.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Lindsay Schilling, who is going to discuss with you quickly the step 2 budget reductions taken by the department as it relates to mental health and substance abuse services.
Mrs. Schilling?
Certainly, I'm just checking my mutes. Good afternoon, everyone. Lindsay Schilling. I will move forward. So related to our step 2 budget reductions and impacts to mental health and substance abuse services, there were 2 actions taken that we feel have the potential to impact those particular lines of services. The first one was a $2.7 million reduction in our local services budget. On our side, we call this our YCAPS budget. This is the pot of money that we make available to our local field offices to support direct services that are provided to our children and families. So in direct services, we're talking about our foster care monthly payments, RTCs, group homes, any mental health evaluations, therapy services that wouldn't otherwise be covered by Medicaid or other payer sources. So that 2.7 million biennial reduction is in that budget. Right now, we have not moved forward with any specific rate cuts or service coverage eliminations. We're really hoping to be able to manage that reduction just through monitoring utilization. I think through COVID, we have seen a decline in the number of children coming into care, at least temporarily. And we have seen fewer out-of-home placements. So just in terms of managing that reduction through monitoring utilization, we hope we don't have to move forward with actual rate cuts for those services. And then the second one, the community juvenile services boards. So currently we have 14 active contracts with different counties to operate their CJSB boards, and these boards have set up juvenile justice diversion programs or court diversion programs in each of those different counties. We were able to maintain funding through the end of this state fiscal year, so through June 30th of 2021. But as of July 1st of next year, we will no longer have any funding to support those 14 contracts. In going through the contracts in detail, we did identify 7 of the 14 counties that do contract out for mental health and substance abuse services, things such as family counseling, mental health assessments. And these would be services provided to clients that are uninsured, underinsured, or for whatever reason, there's not another funding source for those particular services. So DFS's contribution to those diversion programs will be 0 starting July 1 of next year. Were there any questions around those two?
Yes, Lindsay, if we could, Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lindsay, going back to the local services budget, though, my understanding from testimony at Labor Committee, though, has been that the number of child protective referrals is down pretty significantly, or at least maybe not, maybe it's coming back up now that school is back in, but that was way off because of the school closures and all, and that it was thought that that may balloon up again with a backlog in the fall as we get back into schooling. So I wonder if you could just talk about, so I mean, I guess I'm just wondering whether your hope to not have to actually do anything there might not last for very long.
Chairman, absolutely. That is something we're going to be monitoring. I think if I liken this, you know, every case that comes into DFS is a little bit different, requires different funding sources. Some cases can be managed as in-home cases versus kids that come into care. So it's just really this mix of cases, the mix of the services that each of the cases require that really that create the annual expenditure. So I think what we just intend to do is to watch it and monitor that as long as we can. But certainly if we see, you know, this increase in cases, increase in out-of-home placements, increase in group home reimbursements or RTC reimbursements, we'll have to go back and reconsider, you know, rate reductions to be able to manage within that budget allotment.
Follow up, Representative Wilson, are you good? Okay, thank you. Any other questions, committee? As I shift down through here. Okay. Anything else, Lindsay?
Chairman, that's all I had for today. Thank you.
I think we'll go to public comment. Elizabeth, can you share with us who we have?
Mr. Chairman, we have Andy Somerville, but she has notified us that she does not have any comments at this time. We also have an individual who is in the waiting room. We are uncertain as to who that is. We did have one other individual, a Mr. Berkland, signed up, so I'm unsure if we should admit that individual or not. I leave that to your discretion.
No. And we need to find out who the one is. It's a phone number. I know you've reached out to him, but we're just we've found that that's become problematic. We need to know who you are by a real name, and we hate to.
Mr. Chairman, if that is the case, if that person is listening on the YouTube, if you could contact LSO, myself, Elizabeth Martineau, either through email or phone, that would be greatly appreciated.
It would. We're interested in knowing what it is you have to say, and then you know, for people as a whole, as you monitor these programs, we kind of have a deadline trying to figure out who to allow on the public comment. And so generally speaking, if you make an attempt to do a public comment on the day of the Zoom meeting, it'll be rejected. So we, unfortunately, that's kind of how we live in this world today. If it was in person, it'd probably be a bit different. Any other comments? So what I'm going to suggest back to LSO staff, and is that the two individuals that were wanting to provide public comment, if they would provide that public comment in written form back to you at LSO, and then to get that sent out to the committee so that we can review it. It's important, but the dialogue, we need to have a little bit of control of it. So that'll be my request as chairman. Okay. Senator Kinski, let's see. We've got a report from LSO staff on any outstanding. John, Elizabeth, anything that we need to follow up on there?
Mr. Chairman, this is Elizabeth Martineau with LSO. I just wanted to give you guys a brief update. I have provided in your packets 3 different memos, kind of based on some information that you guys have been asking after for quite some time. The first memo is just kind of, there's 2 parts. The first part I think is more interesting for what your exercise is, and that is the Department of Health was kind enough to give us each of the centers that they contract with and the services that each center provides. And so Appendix B in that first memo is really, if you want to know what centers are providing services to what counties, that might be the best source of information that we have right now. And then there was a question that we had about sole provider. And so that was it's a bit of a tricky ask because there is no centralized database for that information. And so your LSO staff, we did a proxy analysis to kind of show you where there are mental health and substance use disorder professionals statewide. And so you have, based on Board of Psychology and mental health licensing boards data. So that's kind of the first memo for you, just kind of gives you an idea of what services or professionals are located. The second memo we provided.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
Thank you. Before we shift to the second one, as I was going through that, it was really interesting information. And one of the questions I had, and it goes even into the second one, is some of the professional licensure. Do we know how many of those might be associated with schools?
That was actually one of the limitations of the data set, Chairman, that I had, which is that it doesn't tell us what types of services they're providing, only their license or certificate, nor does it show us who they're providing. So they might provide services for multiple counties. We would be happy to reach out to try and get that information. This was just kind of a high level to see what interest you may have before we kind of delve down into that level of detail.
Well, and I think the genesis for the question is we were trying to determine around the state where our community mental health providers might be the sole source of mental health services in a rural area or in any area. And if some of these professionals are licensed through the school district or perhaps even through a child development center, do they provide services to the community, or is it so? I just trying to determine how accurately it reflects on the services within those counties, particularly those more rural counties. Is that a fair question?
Again, Chairman, I do not know if that data is available, but I am more than happy to reach out and see if that is some data that the school districts and or one of the boards would be able to provide us.
Okay. Well, and committee, I guess my question on that is one of the questions we heard this morning is this question on general access. And if there's no, kind of goes back to Representative Olson and Representative Barlow's question, if there's not services in the county, then, but all the counties with this document would imply that there are, but if the significant number of those services are tied up in school districts and aren't serving the public as a whole, then that kind of highlights that question on general access, I think. Thank you. Wouldn't you agree? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to proceed?
Please. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. The second memorandum, Chairman Wilson was kind enough to release a bit early. I'd actually prepared this for the Joint Labor Committee. It is a history that originally Representative Barlow requested when he was chairman of Joint Labor to kind of see where the mental health and substance use funding has been over the years from the legislature and kind of what you've approved. And so this is a historic funding now from 2004 all the way through 2020. And it provides you just kind of a real high level overview on the kinds of legislative actions that have happened. And so it's just pure information for you with the last 2 legislative sessions included.
So I had a question on that as well. Sorry, Elizabeth, is in there, back in those earlier years, you refer to Division 2000 mental health and Division 2500 substance abuse. And then later on, that seems to be becomes together under one unit in the Department of Health. It's not, as you get back there a little bit further, you lose the substance abuse and it just becomes mental health. And is that then does, it's hard to track them separately, I guess. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. My understanding, and I of course defer to the Department of Health if they have any additional information, was that at one point they were accounting for those together. And so in the more recent years, they started to separate them. So there'd be a better way of looking at that data. But that before that split that you see when it goes into those individual units, they had just put it all together.
So is there a difference between a division and a unit?
Yes, sir. The division is the like the behavioral health division. It's like the big broad over umbrella, and then the units are the programs under that division.
Because you have, like on page 6 of that, you've got division 2000. And I didn't know if that's division 2000 or unit 2000.
That would be, my understanding is division 2000 and all of its subsequent units.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Mr. Co-Chair,
Yes, sir.
question for Elizabeth.
Please.
Elizabeth, can you push that back maybe to the turn of the century? And the reason I'm asking is it's my understanding that just about the time this data series begins was about the time that Senator Schiffer and Simpson had legislation that profoundly impacted the amount of MHSA funding. I'm curious, before this 04-05, what the level of funding was, because my understanding is the run-up really began about the time that this data sequence begins. And I'm curious how much funding we got by with prior to the Simpson-Schiffer bill. So could you just run it back another 4 or 5 years, please? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, I'd be happy to add about 2000 through 2000 and send that out to the committee.
Thank you. So can I ask, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Representative Barlow, and then I've got another one for you too. Representative Barlow, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to that point, this summarizes the bills and it does not take into account when cuts were made. So just because this is additive does not mean that in 2012 or 2016, dollars weren't taken out of the system. The exercise when I brought this forward, when I was Chairman of Labor Health, the exercise I wanted to understand was what services were we asking the state to actually provide? And you have to look at the legislation to know that, to have that answer. Because if we just put it in a budget, in a line item in a budget, we're not giving any direction. So the reason I brought these in, and I'm not discounting the fact that we can look back further, but the reason that this is important and this legislation is important is because it actually said, use the money for this purpose. That was the legislature giving direction. Now, how much money we give, I mean, that's a different question in my view. And the Co-Chairman Kinski is correct. This was when Senator Schiffer, one, our state funds were much different. And two, Senator Schiffer was there, but almost none of this is codified law. This is all non-codified law. And that is the point, I think, what this exercise is if we want to have a discussion and build a baseline of what we expect for community mental health and what that safety net is, then we should start having a conversation about what's there, what it was intended for, and if we want to actually codify some of that, saying this is our priorities, instead of just having a pot of money that becomes amorphous after whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 100 years, it becomes an amorphous pot with allowing the executive branch to use it as they prioritize. That was the genesis of where this discussion, or at least my effort to have this discussion was, I guess now 4 or 5 years ago. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please.
So Representative Barlow, I don't know if I said something that got you exercised. If so, I apologize. I just was reacting. I'm on the same track as you. My understanding is that not just the level of funding, but the programs to which the funding was directed changed in 04-05 as a result of Simpson-Schiffer. And I have to confess, I don't understand it all quite yet. And I'm with you. I agree. We have an obligation to say, here's what our priorities are, rather than talk just about the top line. But trying to track down and get a handle on my understanding of the Simpson-Schiffer legislation and what programs were added, or whether it was simply an infusion of funding. So I think Representative, I'm on the same track. I think you're way ahead of me. You've got greater expertise in this area.
Representative Barlow, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I wasn't an exercise. Just wanted to make sure we were clear on some of the consequences of that 2005, 6, 7 legislation was actually, directives. Here's money, go do this with it. But how that's changed over time, whether we're still doing those things or whether the same level of funding, whether you go forward or backward, is there, that is what is unknown. So I think there's more work to do, to your point, Senator Kinski, to understand how much money were we spending in 2000 across the board? What changed programmatically and funding wise, and where are we now? And I believe a lot of that, we have been hands off and we've allowed it to be in the hands of the executive branch. And that's where I think the discussion we're trying to have is what are we getting and what do we need and what level are we willing to fund it? And so I think we're on the same page. I just want to make sure that nuance of we haven't been having a conversation about what our legislative priorities are. We have basically pushed that off on the executive branch and said, here's money, go do something. We don't know where it is now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And I do think we're on the same page. So Elizabeth, could we go to page 15 of that document? And so as I read the title page of this it would suggest that this document was going to show the appropriations made in a specific year for these respective divisions or units. And so on page 15, if I read that right, Unit 2502 did not receive any funding, but there was a negative 1.5 million. So was there no standard appropriation that year? And so if there was where does the negative balance come from?
These would be the budget reductions or reductions the agency offered in its budget books. And so this
recommended reductions to the standard budget. And the reason, and that's fine, but as I read the title page, it would suggest that this is the total appropriation, not, does that make sense where I'm getting confused and it doesn't?
That is correct, sir. That would be the total appropriation for that biennium. Because that appropriation, that amount in for that biennium would have been reduced by this 1.2 million.
The exception request that year was a reduction in the standard budget. I see. Very good. Thank you. Then was biennialized, I guess, the next year. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Continue on.
Last but not least, we have memo number 3 that we've prepared. And this is simply, we had been asked to reach out to NCSL to look for some other states examples, particularly for those non-expansion states and what they're kind of doing with their adult populations for those kind of handoffs to communities. And so one of the things that we discovered when we reviewed the material that was provided by NCSL is that they didn't really have a very clear delineator of expansion state versus non-expansion state. The documents really just were examples of policy areas that individuals such as yourself could consider, and then examples of states that are having these practices. And so throughout the materials, there were examples from Georgia and from some of the North Carolina, some of the other non-expansion states, but there was not any consistent information. So we went ahead and just summarized the information they gave us to you. Those 2 documents in particular were what John and I felt were some of the better policy examples that you might consider in your discussions, and just listed those right out for you for the time being. And then if you did have anybody you wanted us to pursue, for example, there are a couple examples out of Georgia that looked interesting. We would be happy to do more research into those, but there were quite a few examples and we didn't want to kind of go down rabbit holes until we knew what you were wanting us to do.
Co-Chairman Kinski, I think that this was something that you had expressed interest in. Would be happy to, if you'd like them to follow up more on that, or if you want to digest that a little bit and then maybe reach out to them, that's fine as well. Okay,
The real meat of it is, Mr. Chairman, is in the two, I think in some of the attachments to that memo, particularly the first one, guidelines for successful transition, the last leg of which talks about continuity of care and assuring that there's a handoff of these folks, which harkens back to our discussion with the fellow from Gateway. What was his name? Craig, Mr. Craig. And it harkens back to the data we heard that of those that are released that are ordered to receive substance abuse and drug counseling, mental health from prison, that we only had a record of 50% of them showing up in the community mental health centers, which means either the record's deficient or they're going somewhere else or they're not receiving the treatment. So that continuity of care conversation and the handoff at each point in the system remains of concern. It looks like we've got all the pieces in place. It just doesn't look like we've really got the handoff, as we heard in the last meeting, where often community mental health centers, they've got the client. They know they're supposed to counsel them for mental health and substance abuse. The client's involved in the justice center, and they can't get enough information out of the rest of the system, whether it's the county attorney's office or the Department of Corrections, in order to make a successful transition. So I think that continuity of care conversation, Mr. Craig just sent a memo through. I think it'll be shared by staff with the rest of you, but it's so top heavy in nomenclature, particular to his profession, that it's going to take me a while to decipher it. And I think our great hope, Mr. Chairman, is probably going to be this conversation between DOC and DOH on whatever it is that they've been asked to coordinate with. I think it's treatment and care throughout the justice system. Are we due for a report on the progress on that?
you, just a second, Sue, do you have an answer to that question, Mary? Just let me know.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. They have been reporting throughout this interim, Senator Kinski, to the Labor Committee. So we did hear a report at the August meeting that they're continuing to work on it. Obviously, things have been somewhat slowed down with all the other things that Department of Health has been doing this interim, but yeah, it's in progress and we're hearing from them.
Mr. Co-Chair.
Please.
Chairman Wilson, is there reason for hope based on what you've heard in August?
I thought they seemed quite hopeful, frankly.
Okay.
There's several of course, there's other people from Senator Schuler, Senator Bouchard, Representative Barlow are also on Labor Committee, so they may have some other interpretation.
I don't hear them. I don't hear them advancing it. Mr. Co-Chair, the one thing that I'd be curious is if there's anything, they're going to hit a limit as to what they can do administratively. At some point, they'll need legislative authorization or direction. Like the simplest that I heard out of Mr. Craig was just being able to access the record prior to discharge for whoever the community-based treatment provider is supposed to be. And if there's some legal reason why DOC can't do that, then I guess that'd be a labor health bill. That's the sort of thing that I think, as long as they're having the conversation, our role is just see, is there a role for us at all?
Okay. Chairman Wilson will kind of follow your cue on that.
Oh, yeah. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. So right now they're following the directions of last session's House Bill 31. And certainly we would anticipate if they need further guidance. I have not heard, I don't remember them reporting any particular need for further legislation on that issue at the last meeting, but there's probably more to come. And I could make some hypotheses on that, but I'd probably be over my skis, as we said. So I won't hypothesize on things that have not actually been reported to me.
Okay.
And Mr. Co-Chair, just one other thought along those lines is Elizabeth, and this is a conversation, Mr. Co-Chair, you and I had with the CSG Pew folks, where I said so much of this justice reinvestment was supposed to be a collaborative effort across agencies, and somehow it ends up too often being a legislative initiative. And a series of documents were forwarded that I think it would be good if the committee hasn't received them, to receive them. And what they are is, it's the original letter that was signed by Speaker Harshman, Senate President, I think it was Beval, then Governor Meade, getting them to come in and promising an effort that would involve all agencies and all stakeholders who come be at the table. I don't know that that's happened. And then an overview of how it's supposed to happen. But I just don't know that the judiciary has been involved in that conversation. I don't know if the county attorneys and prosecutors have been involved in that conversation. And I don't know how we as a legislature would say, we really need to have a broader conversation to really make any headway on this intersection of judiciary and mental health. But I'd appreciate it if those were distributed out to the balance of the committee, because it's enlightening as to what was supposed to happen, and you can ask yourself whether that's really the way it is happening.
So maybe, Elizabeth, would you mind following up with our LSO staff over judiciary to see what efforts, what their take on that effort is, and how that's, if that's been stalled out or in the water there someplace, then maybe we can try and throw a tow strap to it and get it pulled out again. Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I was just going to say that the Judiciary Committee did work on that for, I think it was, and probably Representative Olson can say before he went on to appropriations, but that was certainly a project that lasted several years. And then when Management Council the year before last sent it into the Labor Committee for the community component, the baton was really handed from Judiciary to Labor Committee. But certainly Department of Corrections and Department of Health seem to be all actually pretty enthusiastic about their collaboration. I'm looking to see if I can track down the report that we got at our last interim committee meeting. It's probably stuffed inside of Department of Health's voluminous report. So if I can dig it out, I will forward that to this subcommittee.
Thank you.
And Mr. Co-Chair, I think it's hopeful that they are, and I'm not necessarily asking for Elizabeth to talk to the Judiciary Committee. I talked to Tara. The question is not what we as a legislative body are doing or what we have prodded Department of Health and DOC to do, but what is the process by which the balance of the justice system is at the table in the conversation? The judiciary, the prosecutors, the county attorneys, the circuit court judges. That's when you see the documentation from CSG, you'll see an ideal that has yet to be realized. We're making progress, but we're not there yet, I don't think.
Okay. Committee, anything else? So I think directives then, committee, as I see them back to our LSO staff, is we're going to work on these our community mental health efforts from today and try and have something ready for you, Chairman Wilson, in your last meeting, and we'll certainly keep you apprised of what we're looking at as we move forward on this to see if it makes sense. And then we'll make sure that the committee has an opportunity to review what LSO comes up with, and we can chew on that a bit before we send it to Labor and Health.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sorry, it took me a bit to find my button. So our next Labor Committee meeting is Monday and Tuesday, the 5th and 6th of October, and then our last meeting of the interim will be the 5th and 6th of November, just
And
for
I-
your information.
And I think you have me scheduled to make a report.
Oh, we always like to hear from you, Representative Larson.
Pigs fly too, but happy to do that, and we'll be ready. So if you'd let me know which day that is it, do you know if it's Monday or Tuesday?
For the October one.
No, yeah, for this next one.
I don't know, Elizabeth might know off the top of her head or something.
Yeah, that's a discussion. I'll get that figured
Yeah,
out.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
as a final thing, the phone number is Mr. Berkland, and he would like to provide his public testimony if that is acceptable to you.
that would be just great. Thank you, Mr. Berkland.
I will admit him right now.
Thank you.
We were having technical difficulties, Chairman, and did not know why his name is not popping up, only the number.
Well, and we understand that, and I hope that we appreciate his perseverance and effort to join us in this process. So, Mr. Berkland, when you, I don't know if it looks like we're trying to connect your audio. If you can hear me, once you come on, if you would just announce who you are and who you represent, if anyone, and we're excited to hear your comments. Elizabeth, I'm not quite sure. Is there anything there you can, is he on? Okay, he's on mute. If we could get him unmuted. There you go.
Should be, Mr. Chairman. My
We-
apologies.
We hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies for the confusion on joining also. I'm Bruce Berkland. I'm with the Wyoming Youth Service Association and our members. The list of services provided by Director Schmidt, our members provide many, if not most of those services on that list. And I think her presentation covered those services well. I'm happy to answer any questions. A couple of things I would just clarify would be, I just wanted to mention that crisis shelter services that I think there was some discussion about. I mean, on that continuum, the lower end of the continuum does get used and has many more cases than anything as you go up. So our crisis shelter services serve many more kids than the others. Senator Schuler had wondered about insurance paying on those. The type of services offered at a crisis shelter generally would not qualify under insurance payments. And having that open to one and all is very effective prevention services and keeps 80 to 85% of the kids that come in through crisis shelters into moving any higher in the system. So it's proven very effective over the years and helpful. The gaps in services, I would just mention those high need children, private providers. In some cases, those children have been or attempted to be held in private provider facilities and have blown out of those or not been able to be served successfully in those services. And in addition to private providers, like limited in terms of physical plant and in facility, there's also a much higher risk for the private providers in terms of liability of what we're having, both for the welfare of that child, for the other children we serve, and for staff. In terms of the other gaps in services, there's always been an issue, I think, for services is that as Director Schmidt had talked about in terms of difficulty of getting service if you either have to go through court and a parent gives up custody, or you have to have the right insurance plan, which will allow you access to the higher end services, but not the full continuum of services. So that's been a gap forever, will continue to be. And the step down services from a high level of the PRTF, going directly home from that service can be very difficult, and especially when the kid's been out of state. We have been working with Department of Family Services, and they've been a great help. We're getting much closer. We think and hope to have an agreement where group homes can be able to fill more of those gaps by taking kids and having funding where it doesn't have to be a court order, but there's a block funding that'll make it available, particularly for step downs. We'll still provide, and number one priority will be to court ordered cases and kids, but if and when available, we could provide service to those youth that are being stepped down, or perhaps even have yet and wouldn't have to go to court. So we think that'll could be a huge help, and we look forward to finishing that work with the Department of Family Services. I would just mention, in terms of the reductions that have been mentioned, we understand there's going to be reductions. We greatly appreciate the department's not reduced rates, but if access to care and needed care has to be ratcheted down, that's a great concern also, both for the child and the present system being paid on a per diem basis. That would affect the agency financially the same. Again, developing those block funding proposal that we're working on with DFS would help address that and alleviate that. And then I would just mention it's understandable the community juvenile service block grants had to be eliminated or will be. But again, that's prevention programming in a lot of communities and keeping kids out of court and out of other services. We understand there's cuts. We'll be working on just providing people with more information of what that actually looks like and means in communities. So with that, I would mention one other cut. The Department of Health mentioned the Medicaid limiting of 30 visits, caps for Medicaid payments. Our residential treatment centers those are considered outpatient, as Director Schmidt had explained, in terms of how Medicaid works for RTCs and paying for the therapy. And 30 visits goes very quickly if you're doing a family visit, an individual, and 3 group sessions a week. Within 6 weeks, that 30 visits has been met. We can and will continue to request medical necessity. It'll just be something more we need to take on. So with that, I will stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Birkeland. Committee, any questions for Bruce on this? And also, thanks for your help on, I believe you've been participating in those calls with Director Schmidt on some of the adolescent crisis gaps that we have, and appreciate that.
Very welcome, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Mr. Birkeland? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. Any other public comment? Okay. With that, I think, unless I see any objections, we will put this meeting to rest for the day. Any objections? Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. Thanks to all.